have it here, right? The Western Catholic Church, the Latin Catholic Church. This is, of course, the main Catholic church in the world. But in fact, there are 22 Eastern Catholic churches. These are equally Catholic. They're every bit as Catholic as the Latin Church. They're equal in dignity, and they are just as ancient as the Latin Catholic Church. But most people have never heard of it. These are things like the Syro-Malabar Catholic Church in India, Syrian Catholic Church, the Antiochian, the Coptic in Egypt, the Ethiopian Catholic Church. There are all of these different Catholic churches. And here's what happened. If you remember back in the first century, we talked about this when we talked about church history. Jesus died, and the apostles encountered him in the resurrection, and then they dispersed throughout the Mediterranean world. That was the Roman Empire at the time. And they spread the gospel, and Christianity spread throughout the Mediterranean region. But it didn't just stop at the Mediterranean. Apostles headed in all different directions. We have Mark, who headed down into Egypt, and quite possibly south of that into Ethiopia, it seems. We have Matthew, who at some point seems to, or not Matthew, one of the apostles at one point actually headed east, past Palestine, the Roman province of Palestine, into the Persian Empire, and then through that into modern-day India. That's why we have Indian Catholicism as well. And then, of course, we have a lot of the apostles also went to the west, into what is modern-day Europe, and that became the Catholic Church, the Latin Catholic Church, because Latin was the language of the Western Roman Empire. In the East, it was Greek, because, of course, Greek was the language of the East, because of Alexander the Great, who come 3 centuries before that. So we have Catholicism in the ancient, in antiquity, starting in these different cultures, surrounded by very different peoples, using different language, with different habits, different traditions. And it developed somewhat independently in those areas, more or less. Now, these churches, all these ancient churches were in union at that time, for the most part. They were in union with Rome. In other words, they followed the Pope. Communication was difficult in that day, so it wasn't like, it wasn't exactly as it is today, but nevertheless, they were in union. However, over time, and over centuries, owing to theological differences, primarily probably language differences and misunderstandings over terms, and then just simple political clashes and rivalries and disruptions, most of these churches split at different points from Rome. The Maronite Church in Lebanon is one notable exception. They've been in union with Rome since the very beginning, the first century, which is quite extraordinary, actually. But over time, these churches split away, and we know them today as the Orthodox churches, the Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, etc. But over time, some of those churches returned. They came back into union with Rome. In fact, even relatively recently, I think something like maybe 10 years ago, I recall there was I don't remember which one it was now, but something like 200,000, an Orthodox church with about 200,000, 250,000 people returned to union with Rome. That was quite significant after something like 1,000 years apart. So these churches existed because they grew up and developed in different cultures with different traditions. Their liturgies are quite different and beautiful. If you ever get the chance to experience some of these, they're very different, some of these are very different from one another. They all kind of spring from tradition. So there's kind of an Alexandrian tradition which has a set over here, kind of an Indian tradition which has 2 rites as well. But the fact is there's a lot of diversity in these liturgies, and if you get to go to them, it's really something to see. And so, it's, I think, a testament to the richness of Catholicism. It's a testament to the fact that the Catholic Church is truly universal, as the name says, that we have these sister churches, which again are equal in dignity to the Latin Church, even though they happen to be a little bit smaller. So your family, when you come into the church, will be a little bit bigger maybe than you expected, but I think we can all be very happy. Any questions about that? It was just very brief.
One thing to add,
yes.
That contributed to the schism, since we're talking about the return, was the Turks that sacked Constantinople within the Byzantine Empire. when that happened, we lost contact with Jerusalem and the East, which contributed to the fact of the growing distance between Rome and the Coptic churches and the Syrian churches. Just a notable historical fact.
Cool. And adding on to this, and you'll love this particularly. Brian's fiance is Ethiopia, so that's why I'm going to tell this. This is cool. When the Muslims had the Muslim conquest in the 8th century, and they swept across northern Africa, it cut off Ethiopia from the rest of Christianity, even earlier than the sack of Constantinople. And so Ethiopian Christianity developed completely out of touch with the rest of the Christian world. And so that is, of all of the forms of ancient Christianity, that's the most unique and strikingly beautiful. Seeing yourself.
And interestingly enough, they have a lot of